What's the one issue that's becoming the make or break factor for AI in financial services? Governance, clarity, control, and confidence. Because if you don't have those, you're not really in control of your AI. But many times, governance is seen as the thing that slows down innovation, and organizations just get stuck. The reason? They're thinking about governance too late. AI isn't just a layer of technology. It's directly tied to decisions that impact customers, risk, compliance, and ultimately trust. Let's discuss this more. I'm Diana Rothfuss, and this is Brewing Curiosity, Banking Unfiltered. You're about to watch a slightly different episode of Brewing Curiosity, Banking Unfiltered. Instead of one conversation, I'm bringing together two perspectives from SaaS Innovate, both centered on governance. I'll speak first with Timo Perkett, Partner Global Fraud and Financial Crime Transformation Lead with KPMG International, about why there's a gap between AI ambition and execution. Next, I'll speak with Sri Raghavan, Principal Head of Enterprise Strategy for Data Analytics and AI Tech Partnerships with Amazon Web Services, on what it takes to operationalize governance in real environments, especially as AI, data, and infrastructure all come together. If there's one idea I want you to take into both conversations, it's this. AI governance isn't what slows innovation down. It's what makes it possible to scale. Really appreciate you joining us today to talk about such an important topic. When you look at how organizations are approaching AI governance today, where do you see the biggest disconnect between intent and execution?
Nearly all organizations talk about responsible AI, but only few practice it. We see that 95% of organizations have an AI strategy, while at the same time only 8% already achieve ROI in an extent they expect. So there is obviously a gap between intention and action they take.
Responsible AI gets talked about a lot. But in your view, what does effective AI governance actually look like in daily business decisions?
Effective governance shows up in the choices that the teams make on the ground. So that means how accuracy, explainability, and things like this are monitored in the teams in their daily work. So in that sense, effective governance then is a prerequisite for doing business, and not something that is a side work or an impediment.
No, and I think as we're talking about leadership and governance too, leaders often worry that governance will slow innovation. What have you seen work when organizations try to embed governance without putting the brakes on AI adoption?
Well, we even see that governance can accelerate innovation. If you give the teams the safety through clear guardrails, which data they can use, which data they cannot use, that really allows them to experiment within those bounds. So that is really rather a prerequisite for growth and for innovation instead of a challenge or a break.
Now, if you were advising an executive just starting to scale AI across the enterprise, what's the one early governance decision you'd argue them not to postpone?
Do not wait on the data governance. I think the strict and clear rules for the use of data, the quality of data, that is really something that needs to be done early and is the prerequisite also to accelerate and grow fast on your AI journey.
I think leading off of that last question, so looking ahead, how do you see AI governance evolving over the next year as regulation, risk management, and business ownership start to converge together?
In the next 12 months, expect AI governance to evolve into a mature business function as the risks are increasing and the risk is really getting a boardroom issue. We see that most probably AI governance will part of the enterprise risk management, just as operational risk and financial risk as well. That means there will be standardized controls, integrated reporting, and therefore this is a sign of a growing maturity. So as a broader trend, I would say there is no scaling of AI without the AI governance to match this. So therefore this will really be the prerequisite of future growth of businesses and to scale your AI adoption.
Timo, thank you very much for joining us today and really appreciate your perspective.
Sure, great pleasure.
Thank you. Wow. Let's pause on that for a second. 95% of organizations have an AI strategy, but only about 8% are actually seeing the ROI they expected. That gap, that's not about ambition. That's execution. And this is where governance gets reframed in an important way. Timo said governance can actually accelerate innovation by giving teams clear guardrails. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the real world. Think about a bank rolling out an AI-driven credit decisioning model. Without guardrails, teams are asking, can we use this data? Will compliance approve this? And what happens if this decision gets challenged? And everything slows down. Now flip that. With clear governance guardrails in place, the narrative changes to approved data sources that are predefined, model explainability standards that are built in, and decision thresholds are documented and auditable. Teams don't stop and second guess. They move faster. Now let's look at fraud detection as another example. With those guardrails in place, governance defines how quickly models can be updated, what data can be used in real time, and how decisions are monitored. This means you're not debating policy in the middle of an attack, but you're responding instantly within the lines that are already trusted. That's the difference. Governance isn't slowing you down at that moment. It's the reason you can act with confidence. And if Timo is framing why governance matters, Shri talks about what it looks like when you try to operationalize this across real systems, real data, and real complexity. Shri, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you speaking with us. We're right here at Innovate in 2026 in Grapevine, Texas. As you've been here, what are some of the things that are standing out to you?
Diana, first of all, thanks for having me. Much respect to you. Much respect to SAS. It's great to always have a conversation with our great partners like you. A lot of things, as you can imagine, I'm hearing at the conference, right? I will focus on two things in particular. Hopefully one shouldn't come as a surprise, but everybody is talking about the explosion of generative AI, in particular Agentic AI capabilities. Now, in particular with banking and financial services, you hear a lot about it. And the part that's fascinating to me about the application of Agentic and Agentic AI capabilities in finance and banking is you have a regulatory and compliance layer that underpins all these conversations. So a lot of the questions around, hey, we have these great capabilities, particularly AWS and SAS comes to the table with a lot of these capabilities. How do you make sure that you're doing what's right from the standpoint of compliance and doing the right things for our customers? So I'm hearing a lot of those kinds of use cases and applications, which have moved from the theoretical side to the actual application. These are truly innovative things that we're doing on behalf of customers. So that's number one I'm hearing. Second thing I'm hearing is a lot about data. In fact, I saw a poster there which says from a billion points of data to a point of view. That's precisely the conversations I've been having with, in fact, I was in a conversation with 3 banks, one of which was an EBC yesterday. And they said, look, we've got all these different data sources across the board. But the question is, how do you make sure that we bring all these data together? And how do you make sure that there's data fidelity when we do all our analytics and provide the advice to our banking and financial service customers? So a lot of questions around data fidelity, bringing data together, and all the rest of stuff. These 2 things I've been hearing over and over again, besides other things as well. But
No, thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the things we even heard during the kickoff of this event is talking a little bit about, you mentioned regulatory and compliance. governance and what that looks like. From your perspective, how do you see in the industry leaders kind of adapting to having to have this governance to make sure, from an agentic AI, generative AI, what is that looking like for you and what are you seeing?
Look, one of the things with regard to AWS is that we've always been very cognizant of compliance, of security, of putting in the right kind of guardrails and whatnot, from both the technical perspective as well as from doing the business perspective. Why? Because we operate globally across customers who are actually span the globe, but also customers are in different parts of the globe. So, which means that you have to worry about different regulatory regimes. You know better than anyone else things like GDPR. You have compliance, even within Europe, right? As I was talking to one of the customers yesterday, she said, hey, the French regulations are very different from the German regulations and vice versa, right? So you have to be cognizant of those things. So we've been very strong on being cognizant of the different regulatory regimes that we have to worry about, number one. But in particular, to your question, what we're doing, right, we're putting guardrails into our process. I'll give you one example of a guardrail. Let's, for instance, one guardrail could be that you actually provide ephemeral tokens. So which means, let's say, for instance, you're trying to access a system and you have to do a verification with the token. And the token allows you to be able to access data and you can do all the analytics and so on. But what happens if somebody actually steals your identity? So which means that person now, if they have untrammeled access to your data, they can do all kinds of nefarious things, right? So that's why tokens are ephemeral. So which means they disappear at the end of a certain sessions, so which means you actually have to re-authenticate. So these are some of the things which we've done as a part of our tech stack. Guardrails, as you will see over and over again, when you talk to anybody at AWS, this is one of the things that comes up. And we've been hearing a lot from the leaders across the different customer segments that we have, that these are important, and therefore, particularly for our kinds of industries, banking, finance, insurance, whatnot, this is a kind of compliance we put in place, and there's a greater accent in it that we see over time.
Well, and one of the things you mentioned was data. So another trend that we're hearing a lot in the industry, some things that we're going to be talking about here still, is data decisioning, but how important data is, right? Because if you can't have the data right, if it's not clean, then it doesn't really matter what happens afterwards. What are some of the, struggles and advancements that you're seeing, particularly within banking, when it comes to data and just making sure you have the right data?
Excellent question. There are at least two kinds of challenges, right? One, of course, is, when I used to work with banks in the past, most of the data was pretty structured. You're asking questions like, can we do a path analysis to figure out who's not going to be a customer so we can take corrective action before, that kind of thing, right? Almost all of the data in my past has always been structured. Not so anymore. Now you have a tremendous, it's almost a Cambrian explosion of data across the different sources. So number one, you have a variety of data sources you have to worry about from many different areas, some of which have been gathered with different levels of fidelity and consistency, right? The structured data usually are clean. You do have rows and columns. Sometimes the fully streaming data that comes through, you could have some data missing. So you have that problem. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the data is wrongly transformed or is corrupt. That's a second challenge. The third challenge, of course, is that data is rightfully so, it's curated. Some people shouldn't have access to certain kinds of data. So these three are big challenges. So the question, to answer your question, that we have to worry about is, how do we collect all the data from different sources? How do we make them consistent and clean and uniform? And how do we provide the right kinds of access to the right kinds of people to be able to access information, to be able to do the analytics? So these are three things, again, over and over again, we hear as themes that they're asking partners like SaaS and AWS to get together to provide a solution. Customers really don't care what the underlying technology is. What they care about is you come back to them and say, hey, this is the data I used. I can explain why I came to the decision, and this is a decision to deny credit to this person, but to give credit to this person. And to do that, you need to have data which is good. And that's why the two of us are in partnership for a long time to be able to deliver those kinds of outcomes to our customers.
Well, and all of this is extremely important. And I think as we're looking towards the future, I love the whole crystal ball and as we can kind of see things moving forward. But what would you give to practitioners? What would you give to, executives? Anybody sitting in that seat that has to make decisions moving forward? What is one piece of advice you would give for banks to really continue to stay competitive, but also make sure that they're standing by their customers and providing that excellent customer experience?
I like how you framed that question. I think it's very important. You're looking at it from the standpoint of the customer. Ultimately, with that, we have this leadership principle in Amazon, which is called working backwards. If you're not worried about the customer, then you got problems. So that should be your lodestar, right? Your North Star, so to speak. Now, so one of the things I would tell executives is, look, we are in the era of Agentic AI. And Agentic AI, if done rightly, is going to solve a tremendous number of problems. It behooves you to get educated on how agentic systems work, because it's not trivial. There are 3 layers of agentic, right? One, you have the data layer, the decision layer, the orchestration layer. These are things that executives need to understand, figuring out how to implement them, to speak to the right constituents within their business to be able to get the technology and the processes right. They don't have to do it hands-on, but they need to provide that guidance. And to provide that guidance, you need to have the education. So which means arm yourself with knowledge. It's a tremendously good thing to do that. And that's my one piece of perspective, not so much advice, but my perspective and what I'd like leaders to do.
Sri, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your perspective and views, and just thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Diana.
What I appreciate about Sri's perspective is how clearly it connects governance to real-world complexity. It isn't just about one system or one model anymore. We're dealing with an explosion of data, increasingly complex AI capabilities, and a growing need for regulatory and customer trust. As he put it, you're seeing a shift from structured data to a much more complex landscape with different sources, different levels of quality, and different access requirements. So ask yourself, how do we bring this all together and still trust the outcomes? Therein lies the challenge. Governance today isn't just about control. It's about ensuring data fidelity, managing access appropriately, and being able to say, this is the data we used, this is how we made the decision, and here's why. That level of transparency is no longer optional, especially in financial services. And this is where it gets very real, and where governance is needed in data, decisions, and orchestration layers. I've seen this scenario often. A global bank operating across multiple regions, pulling in structured data from core systems, unstructured data from customer interactions, and third-party data feeds, all feeding into AI models that are making decisions in real time. And now layer on top of that different regulatory requirements by regions, different data access rules, and different expectations for explainability. And suddenly the question becomes, how do you ensure every decision is still trusted? That's what Sri is getting at. Governance must show up across the entire life cycle, not just the model. In the data, in how it's accessed, and in how decisions are being executed. Because if even one piece breaks, trust breaks with it. Now let me leave you with a few thoughts from today's conversations. First, trustworthy AI starts before AI. It starts with your data and your decision frameworks. Second, governance is not about slowing things down. It's about creating the clarity and control needed to move faster and more responsibly. Third, data governance and AI governance are inseparable. If you don't trust the data, you won't trust the outcome. And finally, the organizations that win at this next phase of AI won't just be the fastest. They'll be the ones who can scale with trust, accountability, and transparency built from the start. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Brewing Curiosity Banking Unfiltered. If this sparks something for you, I would love to hear it. Drop a comment of your thoughts, your questions, or even where you're running into challenges with governance today. And if you want more conversations like this, give us a like and subscribe to the SaaS YouTube channel and click that bell so you don't miss future episodes. See you next time.